welcome back to the Bomberman Retrospective. Today we'll be looking at the first ever numbered entry in the series, Bomberman 2. This was the last game the series would ever release on the NES, so it'll be great to see whether or not they left it off with a bang or not. Just like the last two games, there isn't much out there about this one's development. Looking at the credits would tell you that this time it's an entirely different team once again, aside from Jun Shikuma. It should be noted that since the NES game, Shinichi Nakamoto has been absent from the franchise. It's a really surprising thing considering he's the person who reinvented the franchise to begin with. Usually in a case like this, the quality of the games would decrease, but the teams who've been working on them have only been improving them so far. This game is no different. Even though it's structured more like the NES and PC Engine game, it still improves on them instead of just recycling the formula. Unlike the NES game, your starting speed is much faster, so that makes the difficulty much less of an issue. Unlike the PC Engine game, it doesn't have bosses, but in its stead are cutscenes that take place in between each round. They sort of attempted this with Bomber Boy, but it was the same one every time, instead of being a different one depending on the round. Also, unlike the last game, not only can you not choose the level you want to go to anymore, but there is no inventory system. The most obvious thing you're gonna notice off the bat though is how the game looks. Since we're off of the Game Boy and back on the NES, we're dealing with more powerful hardware, but still not as powerful as the PC Engine. And it is obvious that this game takes most of its appearance from the PC Engine game. The Bomberman sprite used in-game is basically an NES version of the PC Engine sprite. The environments are also much more colorful and detailed, just like the PC Engine game. It keeps the game visually interesting, which is probably an issue most people have with the NES game. Even though the PC Engine is way more powerful than the NES, I find myself liking how this game looks more than I do the PC Engine one. Something about its art style is able to strike that perfect NES charm that makes it really appealing to look at. Like I mentioned last time, the gameplay is much simpler this time around. Instead of being able to pick what round you want to go to in any order you want, you have to go through it all in sequential order again. And the gimmicks are nowhere to be found in this game. Some people may think that this makes the game boring, but in my opinion, it gave them a better opportunity to focus on developing one gameplay style instead of trying to develop 6. Which is probably also the reason this game is the shortest one so far, having only 6 rounds instead of what's become the standard 8. The gameplay itself is no different from what you'd find in the NES or the PC Engine games, but it's been even further refined to feel even better than it has before. The power-ups are mostly the same aside from 2 additions. The $, which is supposed to be stolen loot that you're retrieving from Black Bomber, and the vest, which gives you invincibility and would go on to be used in I think every single game after this. Keep in mind though, you're only invincible to your own bombs, not the enemies. And the blasts do have knockback for when you get hit by them. So if you're not being careful, it could be very easy for you to just bomb yourself into an enemy. Speaking of, just like last time, we have a healthy number of returning enemies and brand new enemies, even though some enemies were left behind. The enemies' abilities are way more varied than what they've been in the past, which means you have to change up your strategy a lot more than in other games. For instance, there's a frog enemy that can turn itself into a bomb that will set off your own bombs if the blast radius hits it. There's the returning bats that can fly over everything and get really annoying if you don't have remote bombs. There are ghosts that fade into your exact location and you have to move out of the way before they fully fade in. And there are the blue ones that always bounce from left to right and can go through the breakable walls. This is only a few of the unique enemies in the game, and considering the fact they got rid of the bosses, I think it was kind of necessary for them to beef up the enemy AI. However, even with all that in mind, this is still the easiest game I've had to play so far. The game never gets too hard for me. I never had too much of an issue getting through the levels. Its length definitely helped with that. With only having 6 rounds, it means you can get through the game much faster than you can in the other ones. Depending on the power-ups you have, you can beat some levels in this game in a few seconds. Even though some people might find this as a bad thing, I feel like its tendency to not be as hard as the other ones allows it to be more enjoyable. Out of all the games in the retrospective so far, I have to say this one is most definitely my favorite one. But that could be nostalgia goggles talking, so I'd love to hear what the rest of you have to say about it. This game is a first for the series, as instead of just having cutscenes at the beginning and the ending of the game, there's actually cutscenes in between each round. It's not anything too complicated though, it's just about as simple as you would expect an NES game story to be. Basically, White Bomber was framed by Black Bomber for robbing a bank, and White Bomber has to escape the prison and capture Black Bomber in order to prove his innocence. Some cutscenes use a more illustrated approach with minor bits of animation, and other cutscenes, like the beginning and the end cutscene, use in-game sprites. They're nothing to write home about, but they do break pick up the gameplay in between rounds. Once again, the box arts don't really represent what happens in the game, but they are getting better at representing what the characters are actually supposed to look like. The Japanese and European box arts are the best at this because they just imitate the art style used in the manual for the PC Engine game. The US version has a completely new piece of art drawn up, and while it doesn't look bad, it's still not exactly as accurate as it should be. It's taken the steps in the right direction, but it hasn't fully gone in the right direction yet. It's more akin to the Mega Man 3 box art more than it is the Mega Man 1 box art. Whether that aspect is a good or a bad thing is really depending on the person you ask. Returning to do the music for this entry is Jun Shikuma, and right off the bat you can tell she hasn't missed a beat because the game sounds even better than the PC Engine does. Even though we're back to having to reuse music in some stages, it doesn't happen nearly as often as it does in the other games, simply because there's not as many rounds as there was in the other game. This makes the tracks less likely to overstay their welcome, and given their complex natures makes them even more memorable. My favorite thing about this soundtrack has got to be that, just like Mario 3, it has a lot of percussion instruments in its music. It's the most notable of the power-up theme, and this allows the music to be even more memorable than it was before. Much like the NES game, it's got that charm where it can be listened to over and over again and it won't get tired. The title theme is also really good. Though that could also just be my nostalgia goggles from listening to a lot of Dwayne and Brando. The legacy of this game is much less complicated than any of the other ones we've looked at. Not only were review scores high at the time, but people still think highly of it to this day. Some even throw it on their list of the best NES games ever. Even though this is one of the latest games to come out in the NES's life, people still played and loved this game. That's especially surprising with the US version, which came out in 1993. However, America would never see a re-release of this game. Usually that would lead a game to fade into obscurity, but for some reason this game hasn't. I was introduced to the game through the Dwayne and Brando song that used a remixed version of the title screen's music, and middle school me loved listening to the song so much that it made him want to play the game itself, even though back then I had not a single clue that Bomberman 2 was even the game that this was. This game left an impact on a lot of people, and it's kind of disappointing that it doesn't get re-released as much as it should be. I feel that this is one of the best games in NES's library overall, and I don't see what the problem was with getting it re-released.